I loved it in the book when you talked about being asked by a doctor about your pain scale in 1 to 10, and what I can't remember what it was you said, but is this about like being disemboweled? Is that a 10?
Yeah, it was like during childbirth, and the nurse was like, "Tell me your pain scale," and I was like, "Whoa, what does that mean?" Yeah, is that like disemboweling? Is that what a 10 would be? Because that seems, I don't know, not I have no idea what to answer. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Once a medievalist, always a medievalist. That's it. Yeah.
exactly. You
Yeah.
can't get that out of your head. That's the way it is.
Hi, my name is Kenny Innes, and you are listening to TheoDisc, a place for theological conversations to both challenge and inspire you in your faith journey. On this episode, I'm talking with Dr. Grace Hamman about her book, Jesus Through Medieval Eyes. Now, just that word medieval can conjure up all kinds of images. For some, it's become a code word for violent. For others, you might think of it as the Dark Ages, where nothing much happened. Or for others still, it may be full of fairy tale imagery of chivalry and noblemen. For Grace, it's a period where the literature about Jesus can give us fresh perspectives, where allegory and imagery and art can shake up our historical, grammatical view of the scriptures and cause us to think in a biblical yet creative way about the character of Jesus and what he has done for us. Figures like Julian of Norwich, Fra Angelico, Marjorie Kemp, William Langland, Nicholas Love, and many more from the period can help us see more clearly through the conceptions of Jesus that arose in their time, how he speaks to us in ours. Dr. Grace Hamman holds a PhD from Duke University in English, specialising in medieval literature and theology. She's written for publications such as Plough Quarterly, Mere Orthodoxy, Dappled Things, and Fathom Magazine. She has her own podcast and blog called Old Books with Grace. And her first book is entitled Jesus Through Medieval Eyes, Beholding Christ with Artists, Mystics, and Theologians of the Middle Ages. And that's the theme for our conversation in this episode. Enjoy. Well, Dr. Grace Hamman, it's great to have you on the TheoDisc podcast. Welcome.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So we're going to spend some time in this conversation talking about your work, particularly in your book, Seeing Jesus Through Medieval Eyes. So we'll come to that in a minute. But before we talk about that, you have to run the gauntlet of 3 questions of all first-time guests on TheoDisc. And this is just to help us to get to know you a little bit. So if you pass these 3 questions, then we can go on with the rest of the interview. So there's no pressure here, but we're expecting something decent.
Something spectacular. Great.
So these are 3 things that you return to, and the 3 categories are a book that you return to, a food or a meal that you return to, or a place or location. So let's go with the first one, a book that you return to.
Okay, this is an incredibly difficult question for me because I have different categories. So it really depends on what the category is that I am needing. So I'd say that a book that I return to often in my mind that has shaped my thinking a lot and that I do reread on a fairly regular basis every few years or so is C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. The way that he thinks about formation and about eternity and how that relates to our lives right now. And I just love that book, and I read it at a very formative time in my life. I find that the books I read when I was about 17, 18 are the books that so often ended up being really powerful for me. So that was one of those that I read as maybe a senior in high school, and it has shaped my thought ever since.
And it was interesting that C.S. Lewis book is such an impactful book, and you're not the only person who's been on the podcast who said that's the one that they keep going back to. So it's incredible. So if you're listening and you haven't read that one yet, it's not very long. Grab it and leave you kind of breathless by the end of it. Okay. Yes. What about a food or a meal that you return to?
Well, like I mentioned, I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and we eat a lot of Mexican food there. Arizona's right on the border with Mexico, and our culture is highly influenced by Mexican culture. And my husband and I are both from Arizona, and we cook a lot of Mexican food and we eat a lot of Mexican food. And that is just, to me, the best food in the world. You can't go wrong with a chile relleno or burritos or tacos and all the variants of those. So that's my number one, the comfort food of my life is Mexican food for sure.
Well, I lived in Texas for 12 and a half years, so you have got the Tex-Mex there. Probably a little less authentic than it is in Phoenix. But so when we moved back to Scotland, it's just like can't get a decent taco or anything anywhere.
Oh, no, Tex-Mex is so good. I mean, it is different than the Mexican food I grew up on, but it's delicious.
So what about a location or a place that you return to?
This is a tough question. I think the Sonoran Desert around Phoenix is, to me, one of the most beautiful places in the world because it has this beauty that you have to pay attention to. It's not necessarily obvious, but it's actually full of life and full of its own unique kind of beauty. And as a result, I love returning to it because it's a place that is unlike any other in the world, and the wildlife is unlike any other, and it is the place of my childhood. So its smells, its sounds, its birds, its light, all those things feel like they are a little foretaste of heaven for me.
Great. And you talk about it in the book, don't you?
I do, yes.
Yeah.
It's very formative for me. And there's a lot of places I love to return. I mean, living next to the Rockies, the 14ers, my husband and I hike one each summer, and there's nothing like those places, those high places. They're spectacular. So I love to return to those as well. But the Sonoran Desert is probably my heart return, I think. Yeah,
brilliant. Well, great. Thank you. I think you did really well there, so we can proceed. Oh, great. Well, let's talk about, first of all, before we get into the book, how did your interest in medieval literature arise?
Yeah, well, it is a funny thing for like this girl from Phoenix to be interested in. It's not like Scotland or the UK. There's nothing medieval there. So it was definitely a surprise for me as well. I always loved history. I always loved the books of the past. I loved old novels. And then as I became an English major at university, I took a class called History of the English Language. And I just thought it was so cool that all of our English words have these little histories behind them, whether they're imports from another language or whether they are really deep in the tradition of English and Old English and then beyond. And I became really interested in that. So then I took a class on Chaucer. Yeah. And I loved Middle English. I just thought it was so interesting. It was like a puzzle. It was fascinating. And then even more so, I fell in love with Middle English because I went to a very, very secular university, a big state university, 40,000 students, giant. And in Middle English, you could not escape Jesus. Like, you had to talk about him. He was everywhere. Yeah. And I was enchanted by this marriage between like the beauty of the old language and the fact that everything was pointing to Christ, and in ways that were really weird a lot of the time, not always like spiritually edifying necessarily, but sometimes very spiritually edifying and formative. So I was kind of just enchanted by that. And then I felt like then it was kind of a rabbit hole into just deeper and deeper until I was like, oh my gosh, I'm getting a PhD in Middle English, and I'm not exactly sure how I got here, but I really love it, and this is who I am now. I suppose I'm a medievalist. So.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I loved it in the book when you talked about being asked by a doctor about your pain scale in 1 to 10, and what I can't remember what it was you said, but is this about like being disemboweled? Is that a 10?
Yeah, it was like during childbirth, and the nurse was like, "Tell me your pain scale," and I was like, "Whoa, what does that mean?" Yeah, is that like disemboweling? Is that what a 10 would be? Because that seems I don't know. I have no idea what to answer. So yeah,
Once a medievalist, always a medievalist. That's it.
exactly. You can't get that out of your head. That's the way it is.
So you're making an assumption there that because I'm in the UK and many of the people listening to us in the UK, that we will have kind of a broader knowledge of medieval history. But actually, I think you might need to tell us a little bit about the Middle Ages or the medieval period, because I think most of us would think of that period as a time when people were either kind of covered in mud and or armor. That's kind of the whole thing that we have. So tell us a little bit about maybe some of the assumptions that we make about that period.
Yeah, it's such an interesting time period because we do have so many assumptions about it that are really mainly formed maybe through like Hollywood adaptations or depending on your confessional background. A lot of Protestants are very suspicious of the medieval era because it's pre-Reformation, and a lot of Catholics are very nostalgic about it because it's pre-Reformation. So there's a lot of assumptions coming in.
Yep.
And when I say medieval, I have a very broad sense of it as this period between about 500 AD, about the fall, the first, the sacking of Rome, all that stuff, around the time of Augustine. He's often talked about, St. Augustine of Hippo, talked about the last classical man and the first medieval man. He's kind of this bridge into this new world. And then at the other end, you have the Reformation, Martin Luther, around 1500, the rediscovery of America, of the New World, all that stuff. So this is a massive time span of about 1,000 years, and scholars differ a lot on the ends and the beginnings. But that's kind of the rough basis of it. And so even to talk about that period as the medieval period is a little bit misleading because obviously there's a lot of different things going on between 500 and 1500, right. A lot of different cultures, a lot of different historical moments, a lot of different emphases theologically or what's happening in that world of medieval Europe. So it's a little bit of a tricky word that way, but that's historically speaking the time that I talk about. And what I focus on specifically is the much later end of that period. The book covers some early things, but my studies were in 14th, 15th century, that towards the very end of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, and going back to C.S. Lewis, and he talks about a chronological snobbery that we have when we look back. We think we have it all sorted out now. But what you're trying to say in the book is, no, there's actually some voices that we really need to listen to. So why have you found that the case, particularly around the person of Jesus?
Yes, so I think today we are, for both good and for ill, we're very attached to, the real Jesus as the historical Jesus. So we are talking about this moment in Palestine, who he is, and very attached to like, okay, this happened, this is historically accurate, et cetera, et cetera. And in the Middle Ages, they wouldn't have talked about Jesus that way pretty much at all. They were not particularly interested in the historical aspect. But what they did understand is that when we approach God, we're always approaching him through metaphor and through different representations of God. So unless you were actually living like Peter or like John or Mary Magdalene in that time period with Jesus, we're always going to be approaching him in a mediated way, whether that's through the gift of Scripture and the Holy Spirit. But we're not going to be like looking at Jesus face to face until we die. And so they were much more comfortable, the medieval church, with metaphor and with thinking, okay, when Jesus says, Jerusalem, how I long to gather you under my wings like a mother hen gathering her chicks. They looked at that and said, well, what does that hen image tell us about who Jesus is and his character? Or when Jesus talks about Judgment Day, they think about judgment and justice. And they go, when we make these paintings of Jesus as a judge, what are we saying about him? What's going on here? So they have this different, much more image-oriented and expansive way of trying to figure out who Jesus is, this question that all of us follow the disciples in having to ask ourselves and in having to answer. And that's what I really appreciate about medieval artists and theologians and scholars.
Yes, and there are multiple images that you speak about in the book, including, as you've said, Jesus as the judge, Jesus as our lover, as the Word, as a good medieval Christian, as a wounded God. But I'd like us to kind of spend the time that we have here looking at just a couple of those images. And the first one I was interested in was Jesus the knight. Because, again, when we think of knights, we have this idea of chivalry. Perhaps people might have an idea of the Crusades, or many people listening might just be thinking about Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You know, we have all these images of what knighthood is. So can you talk to us a little bit about kind of the assumptions about what a knight was in the period?
Yes. So it's that's an image that, we have no firsthand experience with knights, other than through movies or maybe through poetry or plays or whatever, or Monty Python. And so at first this image feels really outlandish and strange. Medieval folks were really interested in the idea of Jesus as a knight, drawing on the kind of armor of God in Scripture and on Jesus rescuing us, that whole idea of rescue. And then also it intersects with some of the language of Jesus as a bridegroom and as a lover, which relates to that chivalric tradition you're talking about. Yeah. But for medieval folks, they would have thought about knighthood as an actual real status in life that people had. So it was connected to something very real. It wasn't just a storybook. It had some of that storybook connotations, like in King Arthur and his noble knights. But this was, the king had knights and noblemen were knights and knights fought in battles. And this was a real social status that people were born into. It was not socially mobile. It was a particular class. And so what we begin to see is some really interesting movements with Jesus, because knighthood is also obviously connected to violence. Knights were part of a fairly violent culture that did good things, protected their land and peasants when they were doing their job properly, but a lot of the time they weren't. And a lot of the time this was a role that had a lot of power and not an awful lot of accountability to the people who weren't as powerful and who couldn't fight in combat, who couldn't appeal directly to the king, all those kinds of things. So this was a very culturally complex image. But one of my absolute favorite images of Jesus as a knight is this poet named William Langland, who wrote a poem called Piers Plowman. And in it, Langland is thinking really hard about labor and about if Jesus is a knight who saves us from the dragon of death, what kind of knight could he be that didn't belong to that social scheme where he was really oppressing the poor or just perpetuating further violence in medieval society? And so Langland writes of Christ as this barefoot knight who's dressed actually like a plowman. And this would have been just absolutely shocking, because the idea that anyone in power, and especially in that chivalric position where actually how you dressed and your armor and your banners and all those things were important indicators of your status, right, and important, showed that you were a real knight. To dress as a plowman becomes this radical picture of incarnation where somebody who is in utmost power takes on the position of the powerless in society and aligns with them. And so it's this beautiful image of the knight who jousts death, but who is dressed as a plowman and comes in this humble guise of just a laborer who labors for us. And so it's lovely.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's not a one-to-one correlation between kind of the what a knight would be and what the image is in the poem. There's a kind of a subversion, I guess, that's going on there.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I did think about Isaiah too, about the beating the weapons, the spears into plowshares, and I thought about that as it's not just, I guess, allegory. In the poem as well, he rides on a donkey. There's this kind of attempt to kind of correlate the Jesus of the Bible and implement it into this image as well, which I loved.
Yes, it's such a fascinating and multi-layered and clever allegory where he's riding Palm Sunday up into basically the whole events of Holy Week. Langland is
Yeah.
writing this scene of Jesus as a knight. So he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey as a plowman, and he's barefoot, which again is a sign of poverty. That's a sign of
Mm.
humility. That's not the typical powerful knight choice. And in the cross, he jousts death, and then he harrows hell, which is the ancient idea that when Christ died, he descended into hell, as we say in the creed,
Mm.
and then there he breaks down the gates of hell. So, like a knight laying siege to a medieval city, Jesus lays siege to hell and frees all the patriarchs and the prophets and the prisoners. And so it's drawing on this deep well of the events of Holy Week and of this ancient tradition of the harrowing of hell, and how paradoxically Christ, there's another medieval poem that just puts it so well that a medieval preacher had recorded in his commonplace book, and the poem is, I am Jesu come to fight withouten shield or spear, so without shield or spear.
Yeah.
And that's that image of the God who has come to save us in this utter rejection of violence that culminates in his violent death on the cross, but this radical peace and joy that comes out of that. So
Almost like a king who chooses not to assert his power, but to give himself for his friends and for his enemies.
that's
Yeah,
right. That's
love
right.
it. Another image that you talk about in the book is Jesus the Mother, which is an interesting idea. Just going to quote something that you said in the book. You said, many of us are unfamiliar, even uncomfortable with the ancient scriptural tradition of Jesus as a mother. This metaphor is not new age, or about Christ's biological sex as a human, but it is grounded in robustly theological and biblical metaphor. Now, some people might think Jesus' mother is grounded in biblical metaphor. Is it? So talk to us about this image that is popular in some of these medieval writings.
Yes. So it's such a funny image because we just have no association of Jesus with motherhood. That feels like a stretch for us. But the monastic writers of the High Middle Ages, so people like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, Aelred of Rievaulx in northern England, and many others, noticed these themes of motherhood that earlier commentators had also noticed, but these were the first group to really start working deeper into that image. They weren't the first ones to notice it, but they took up themes like Christ calling himself the mother hen in the Gospels, and ancient themes in the Hebrew scriptures on God as wisdom, all the female language around Sophia, and
Mm-hmm.
all that kind of stuff, and began to think about Christ's words that you must be born again through me. And they went, hey, born again, that actually is not happening out in space. That's a very real thing that human mothers do. Humans bear children. Christ is like a mother to us in our salvation. And so there develops this really interesting tradition, thinking about how, again, in birth, blood and water, which are, of course, the elements of the sacraments, that is a part of birth. And so they really associated this idea of Christ as a mother with the sacraments of both the Eucharist and of baptism. And in baptism, of course, we are born again. And so that was where this tradition really began. So it's a very robust theological tradition. It's not a stretch when you begin noticing all these threads, and when Christ himself uses these words. And Paul, of course, too, also describes himself as a mother laboring for our salvation. So
Yeah.
these monks, who were not like feminist or fans of women really in general, they noticed that there was this very feminine quality to the kinds of compassionate leadership that Christ and Paul and many of the other church fathers and mothers practiced. So they said, what can we learn about this, about Jesus, how he loves us as a mother loves her children? And that was the roots of a lot of that tradition.
Yeah, and you talked about in the book about how pregnancy, you can't kind of avoid it as an embodiment, even though people sometimes now do try to avoid commenting about if women are pregnant or not. But it's this real physical sign of embodiment that's connected with this idea of incarnation.
Yes. Yeah. So Julian of Norwich really draws upon this theme, one of my favorite writers that I mentioned earlier. And she thinks about incarnation as related to pregnancy, because it's both these themes of embodiment and of creating new life. So in the incarnation, Christ labors with us, and then on the cross, he gives birth to us in our redeemed life with him, in the full life of the kingdom of God. And it's a beautiful and very strange set of images that are very challenging for us, but that lead us to meditate really fruitfully on the ways that God doesn't love us in the abstract. I think sometimes we fall into a trap of thinking of ourselves as sort of this conglomerate, this abstraction of people. Yes, we are the children of God, but like he has so many children, like I'm just one of all of them. But Julian uses that imagery to describe and to think about how mothers pay such special close attention to their particular children, and how that kind of particularity is the kind of love that Christ bears for us in his dying for us and in his knowing us.
Yeah, and of course, Paul's encouragement for us to grow up into Christ. I love this idea you spoke about as Jesus kind of parenting us and helping us to develop and grow like a mother would with their small children.
Yes, I love that. There's a beautiful passage in Julian where she talks about how he teaches us to love all that he loves for his love. That idea of our loves being formed in his gentle and compassionate parenting, and how he disciplines us as well, and how that's part of this parenthood, is that the discipline is the loving and attentive and unique disciplining of a parent to each of her children. And so that's such a beautiful image, and of how deeply he shares himself with us in his flesh, in our flesh, this incarnational motherhood.
Yeah. Throughout the book, you have a lot of images that you have in there to help us to see kind of some of the thinking as it's put forward in creative pieces. And in this chapter, there's an image of people being born out of the wounds of Christ, which is just, it's such a strange but a really beautiful image, actually. It sounds good. It doesn't sound as you're describing it, but yeah, out of his side, new believers are being born.
Yes. And I love teaching with this image when I'm giving lectures, because the energy in the room is so palpable when this image comes up, because it is so bizarre at first. You're like, oh my gosh, but you see the little baby church coming out of Christ's side wound, where the spear pierced him, and you just see that concretized image of we are born again in his death, and an image that would have been made all the more poignant by the fact that so many medieval women died in childbirth. So this connection between childbirth and death was so real, so tangible, and the risk and love of motherhood in giving life would have been so relevant to them. And it is to us today too, but it's more of a stretch. We have to think about it more seriously. Yeah.
Yeah. In one of the last chapters of the book, you speak about Jesus as the good medieval Christian. And you reference the ways that medieval literature or art cast Jesus in line with their own culture and religious expression. And so can you talk to us a little bit about how that was maybe helpful for them and some ways that it's maybe not so helpful?
Yes, this was a really interesting chapter to write. It was pretty challenging because we so often see the mistakes that other cultures make in talking about Jesus. It's pretty easy for us to be like, wow, that was a stretch. That was wrong. That was a mistake. But what we don't realize is that we are doing the same thing all the time, even in our very best intentions. And that's what looking at these medieval portrayals of Jesus, which are so culturally based, can help us kind of re-examine in ourselves. Like, wow, I've been making some serious assumptions about who Jesus is that is just fully based on my own opinions in my own time and place. So there was a very popular genre of writing in the later Middle Ages that helped readers to contemplate the life of Christ by imaging it in their heads. And so the book that I use in this chapter is by this 15th century fellow named Nicholas Love, who was writing in English and who had translated this earlier work that was a Franciscan work that helped you to imagine Christ's life. And so in it, you have some really, to us, very funny moments, like after Jesus has been fasting in the wilderness, the angels come and minister to him. And there's this whole scene where Jesus is, he has such excellent table manners, even though hasn't eaten for 40 days, but he's just like so genteel in how he's eating his food. And we look at that and we go, that is really kind of silly. It kind of tickles us. But it expresses what they were wanting to say is, look how he's a true nobleman. Like, he's truly noble, and he's reflecting that, like, no, he's like, wait, he's not a peasant. Like, he's the real deal. He's from the line of David, you know?
Right.
And so we look at that and we just are, wow, that's, why would you care about that? Or that's kind of ridiculous or whatever. And so that's like a relatively innocent example of one of these, it was so deeply culturally embedded. Nobody would have thought, oh, that's ridiculous. They would have been like, yep, that's how Jesus was. That's 100% how he was. That's who he is.
Yeah.
And we do that too. Today we go, Jesus would like this or he wouldn't like that. And we're very confident in our assertions of these things. So this chapter is kind of meant to circle back to ourselves, to be a reflection towards humility of like, wow, there's a lot that we should be more careful about and should be more cautious about when asserting this is God, this is the will of God. And history helps us to take that moment and apply some of those same insights to ourselves. Where am I doing that? Where am I just falling into pretty blatant assumptions because that's the world I live in?
Yeah. The recasting of Jesus in our own image is so easy to do. And I read today a politician saying, I won't say where or what the issue was, but they said, just like Jesus said, what you do to us, we'll do back to you. A complete subversion, of the Sermon on the Mount. But we all do it, right? We all think Jesus is just like me.
Yes.
And so although it's easy for us to scoff at medieval depictions of Jesus, we are prone to that same thing. So I wonder if you would, as we kind of close up this conversation, if we could think about if someone from the medieval period might view us and our modern perceptions of Jesus, what do you think they might say?
I think one thing they would call us out on most, especially these medieval artists and monks and theologians that I think about in this book, I think they would call us out big time on our relationship to money. I think in the Middle Ages, they had every age has had problems with money and possessions and thinking that through. But they were, pre-capitalism, consumer mass production, all that kind of stuff that has made our world such a different place in good ways and in bad ways. But I think they would say, you guys have a real interesting thing with money in the church that that maybe needs some attention. I think that's one thing. That's less directly about Jesus. I think another thing they would say is that you guys should be a little more creative. I think their comfort with metaphors led them to read scripture and find those things like Christ as a mother that is there and present and that can elucidate some of his character to us, because we are much, much more comfortable, again, in a lot of ways that are good, a lot of the time, with a very, very literal interpretation. And there's nothing else outside of that. So instead of reading multi-layered like medieval people loved to do, we foreclose ways of understanding God that are a little more like Emily Dickinson said, tell the truth, but tell it slant, a little more slant-wise into truth. And so they would encourage us, I think, to be more comfortable with story, more comfortable with metaphor and allegory, because those are gifts that Christ himself uses in the parables. He has given us these ways to be creative in thinking about who he is, that are still faithful and witnesses to himself in Scripture, that aren't just made up or flights of wild fancy, but that are gifts.
Yeah. Well, Grace, thank you so much. I think that's a good place to end in this call to see Jesus creatively, both through the Scriptures and in our world as well, and to see for the places that he's at work. Love that you've finished with the quote from Gerard Manley Hopkins about Christ playing in 10,000 faces, and I think that's really important for us to see where Jesus is at work in our world, and looking at these medieval figures is really helpful for that. So I really appreciate you spending the time. Any last word you'd like to give to our listeners before we go?
Just don't feel intimidated to read the people of the past. This is what I'm telling people all the time. We limit ourselves when we read only in our own time and place. And the church is so much bigger and so much more beautiful and so much more reflective of Christ in all those 10,000 places and spaces than we can even imagine. And that has been such a gift to me. And I always say that to everybody. Read the past. Don't be afraid. Just give it a try, even if you don't fully understand it.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. And really, I would encourage you to get the book, Jesus Through Medieval Eyes, and have a read. And let that be, if you are feeling slightly intimidated, let that be kind of an initial guide. I loved as well that at the end of each chapter, you have real reflective moments, kind of drawing people into their own relationship with Jesus and deepening that. So that's brilliant. Grace, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I had a blast.